Buenas tardes, bienvenidos. Good afternoon, welcome. I'm Magdalena Mieri. I'm with the program in Latino History and Culture at the National Museum of American History. It's a pleasure to have you all, and particularly our panelists, to present the program that we have organized jointly with the Smithsonian Latino Center with my wonderful colleagues Roland Roebuck and Eduardo Diaz. Thank you for their support. And honored to present this wonderful group of panelists to honor Black History Month with this program considering the Afro-Latino experience. This is a group of wonderful people that I've known, most of them for many, many years, and I'm glad that they were able to make time to have a conversation about this important topic of Afro-Latino experience in the United States, and it's particularly important within the context of the National Museum of American History. I'd like to introduce our moderator, James Early, sitting right there in the middle. James is a very well-known social activist on these issues of Africanness. He is currently the Director of Cultural Studies and Communication at the Center for Folklife Programs and Cultural Studies. He's very active internationally, really being the leader in many Latin American countries, bringing forth issues of Afro-Latino and cultural preservation, and I'm delighted that he has agreed to moderate this panel today. We also have, James will give you a little bio about each of them, but I'm delighted to meet María and Jackson for the first time, perhaps here at the Smithsonian. Juan Flores, whom I've known for many years, Miriam Jiménez, Román, and Roland Roebuck. Thank you so much. Enjoy the presentation. We're going to have the program for about an hour, and then we'll invite the audience to ask questions, and please use the microphones that are at the side. We are webcasting. Welcome also to our online audiences, and feel free to participate. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Smithsonian Institution. I am most pleased and very honored to have been invited by two long-term friends and colleagues who are really extended family members to come and moderate this panel. Miriam Jiménez, whom I've known for way back into the last millennium, along with Juan Flores, who are the co-editors of this project, and to join Maria Rosario Jackson, who's a colleague in the cultural arena. We have done a lot of work together, and my longtime other extended family member, Roland Roebuck, who is a super activist, among other things. Before I go to them giving their particular institutional references, I want to note that this is, I think, a most important volume that I urge you not only to get one copy of, but if you know others who are in need of situating the issue of racial identity and the complexity of the African influence in the United States and across this hemisphere, I think this is a most important book. I was just saying to Miriam that until this is translated in Spanish and to Portuguese and perhaps French, I hope they will rewrite the introductory essay, just removing a few references to the actual entrance in the book, because I think it's a most important element. The mandate of the Smithsonian Institution is the increase in diffusion of knowledge, and I think it's very important that we situate today's discussion in that context. We are charged with helping the American public to understand how we have come to be who we are and what is our place in the world as a nation. And I'm mindful that perhaps the most resonant Afro-Latino issues and presentations that have occurred in this institution have occurred with Mario Bauzo being on the stage, being honored by the program in African American culture, which speaks to the cross-cultural context of the introduction of this book, or the presence of the great Cuban father of Afro-Cuban music, Arsenio Rodriguez, who was brought here by Rene Lopez with Bernice Regan, the founder of Sweet Honey in the Rock, for the Festival of American Folklife. Our Grillo from Tampa, Florida, who also speaks to the cross-cultural context with Schomburg of the relationship to African American communities, and his depositing about 5 years ago some of his work in the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum, which is a prototype of the American Neighborhood Museum. So the Smithsonian has had an engagement with this, but this book takes us to a more solid ground. And finally, I'm mindful that in this introduction, the transnational context of looking at the presence of Afro-descendants in Latin America, over half of Brazil, somewhere between 80 and 100 million Afro-Brazilians, the largest group outside of Nigeria of African descendancy, not just in skin color, but in culture, or the 7 to 10 million perhaps in Venezuela, or perhaps 15 million or more in Colombia. I was just at the African Union Conference of technical experts on the diaspora in South Africa last week, and there were representatives from Nicaragua, from Venezuela, from Cuba, from Panama, with representatives from across the African continent. And the issue of Afro-descendants has emerged as a most significant theme in that context. Well, today you will have an opportunity to hear from the co-editors of the book, who are also authors. We will, starting, let me give an introduction of each of them. To my far left, María Rosario Jackson, a Senior Research Associate and Director of the Culture, Creativity, and Communities Program at the Urban Institute of Washington, D.C. She earned a doctorate in urban planning from the University of California in Los Angeles. To my immediate left is Dr. Juan Flores, professor in the Department of Cultural and Cultural Analysis at the New York University. He is translator of memoirs of Bernardo Vega, Cortijo's Wake by Edgardo Rodriguez, a number of other really commanding publications. I won't go through them all, but I do recommend you check out his work. And to my immediate right, the other co-editor of the book, Miriam Jiménez Román, is the executive director of the Afro-Latino Latina Forum, a research and resource center focusing on Black Latinos in the United States. And for over a decade, she has researched and curated exhibitions at the Schomburg Center for Research and Black Culture, where she has also served as director of the Scholars, assistant director of the Scholars in Residence program, and is presently a scholar in residence at that program. There is an entire chapter on Schomburg and his singularity in the historical development of Afro-Latinos. And to my far right, but that I could put way over to my far left.
Thank you. I like that politically.
The man I refer to as El Alcalde de Washington, D.C., Roland Roebuck, formerly working in the D.C. government. But I think it's fair to say that in my 30-some years in Washington, Roland Roebuck has been the most active, anti-racist, transformative voice about the issues of Afro-Latinos for many people like myself, African Americans, who just thought we were all black and did not understand these distinctions. He has also been a very strong voice in this Smithsonian institution and every other major institution in Washington, D.C. to say, so where are we? Where are our voices? So let us begin. Let me first start with Miriam Jiménez Román and ask, what stimulated this volume?
What stimulated? There've been a lot of stimuli, but most directly, I think I would point to the 2000 census. And if any of you remember, right after the 2000 census came out, the initial figures, the discourse that was that the figures were wrapped around was one of conflict between African Americans and Latinos. Essentially, it was a black versus brown, that now Latinos, the brown ones, were supposed to outnumber African Americans, and so because of these new immigrants and all of the cultural differences between these two groups, that we could expect nothing but conflict, and that this was going to be exacerbated. That linked to some very personal and professional concerns of mine, the personal in the fact that I am a child of immigrants, the daughter of immigrants who grew up in Harlem in New York, and who spent most of her professional life within the African American context, listening and to this discussion about conflict between Latinos and African Americans was very problematic for me. It basically put into question everything that I knew personally, and most of what I knew in terms of my scholarship, which concerned the presence of people of African descent in the hemisphere. So I was concerned that people really didn't know the history of people of Latin America and the Caribbean and the United States, that those kinds of adversarial positions that they were proposing came out of an ignorance about the reality of the history and culture of this country. And so that is a kind of short answer to what proposed.
Would you give the audience some kind of chapter overviews? What are some of the categories in this volume that they can anticipate reading when they buy this volume?
It's a very eclectic mix. Let's start with that. So culture is defined in the most expansive terms possible, and it includes poetry, personal essays. It includes writings about the way culture is expressed, so that there are sections on things like Latin jazz and hip hop, both areas that have been very much influenced by so-called Latinas and Latinos. We can get into a discussion about what it means to use even that term, Afro-Latino and Afro-Latina. It's not without its problems. There are pieces that are straight up sociological or straight up historical. They were done by academics. They take on the usual rules of the Academy of Scholarship, with the exception that we edited out a lot of the extra baggage and tried to make them as readable as possible. So it's scholarship, but it's not jargon laden. It's fairly easy to read. What other pieces, Juan?
The other co-editor,
Can I talk now?
Juan Flores, you have permission to jump in here and lay this out for us.
Yeah, the whole thing is structured historically, that we try to go back to the earliest presence of what would now today be called Afro-Latinos in U.S. history, and trace it all the way back to before Jamestown. Before the founding of the Republic of the United States, there were already Afro-Latinos or Black Spaniards who came with the initial conquistadores and landed off the coast of Florida. One very famous one, a guy named Estebanico. He's kind of our prototype, or Afro-Latino, the original Afro-Latino in a way, not just because he was a Black Spaniard, so he combined the Spanish language culture or the Iberian background with the African, but that because his experience being in between those two was paradigmatic of all Afro-Latinos yet to come, all the way down to the present. So his experience was that uniquely Afro-Latino experience that we have. So in any case, the first part of the book the first section is the historical backgrounds, how this experience goes way, way back, 16th century, not only in Florida, but we also have a section about the Southwest and the Afro-Mexican presence in the Southwest, throughout the Southwest, an example being the state of California, where the last Mexican governor was an Afro-Mexican. We have a picture of him in there. Mm-hmm. And there was an ample presence of Afro-Mexican in the Southwest, much less than has ever been assumed. And then we have a piece also about the area of Louisiana, Mississippi, in that area, with the so-called Creole origins of the cultures of those regions, and the Afro-Latino presence there. And then the rest of the book really goes, without mentioning stages or periods, up to the present, up to much more recent phenomena. Most of it is, of course, 20th century presence, but as James mentioned, we have a section on Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, who was, in a sense, the first person to conceptualize what would be an Afro-Latino experience in the United States way back at the beginning of the 20th century. And we include a writing of his. It's usually his writings themselves aren't even included when he's talked about, but we included a section from a writing of his where in 1913 he was the first one to ever call for the formation of Black studies, of the field of Black studies. And so this is a great accomplishment, and many other things that we owe to Arturo Alfonso Schomburg in this background. Then we have sections on Afro-Latinas. We have one having to do with issues of gender and sexuality in the Afro-Latino experience. We have, again, a section called Roots of Salsa, which traces the coming together of African-American and Afro-Cuban and other Afro-Latin American musical forms and experiences in New York and in the United States during the 40s and all the way up to more recent times. We have another section, separate one, on hip-hop, because that's during that period of hip-hop when the concept of Afro-Latino really comes into its own and gains a kind of currency. Since the 90s, actually, is where we trace the history of the term Afro-Latino in the United States. While the experience goes way back to the very beginnings of what is now the United States, the term itself didn't emerge until, as Miriam was saying, things became clear that they were pitting the African American and the Black and the Latino against each other as mutually exclusive and, in fact, as naturally hostile groups and concepts. That's when we realized, wait a minute, we've got to straighten this out. There are people who are both. And right there. And that's something that needs to be clarified. So I think the agenda of the book, as Miriam was laying out, is about that. It's about what is the relationship between Blackness and Latino-ness in the United States. We know that, as James said, the idea of Afrodescendiente in a Latin American culture goes back to Latin America. That's where the movements really got going. But then the application of all of that to the United States is what this book is trying to begin to document and analyze.
If I may. There is a piece in the book in reference to the Black Mosaic, which was the exhibit that the Smithsonian coordinated, especially the Anacostia Museum. And I see Hector Colparan here, who played a key role in the assembly of that great exhibit that helped to increase the awareness of the presence of Afro-Latinos in the Washington area. And that was, extremely effective as an educational tool.
Exactly. And a lot of the pieces, though, are personal testimony that people writing about their experience of being Afro-Latino, Black Latino, and the combinations. And one of the pieces we're most proud of and we love is by María Rosario Jackson about her experience. So I don't know, maybe you want to
this would be a
good time to jump in and what your vantage point is on this.
Well, I was really pleased to be invited to contribute to the work, because I do think it's really important. And my essay is a very personal essay. It's about growing up in I hesitate to call it a biracial household, but an African American and Mexican household in Los Angeles in California. Grew up there, born and raised there. And the whole experience of growing up, partly from an immigrant mother, African American father with Southern roots to the Midwest and then West, was one that made me from very early on challenge the idea of race, ethnicity, and the categories that are imposed on one. So the essay is very much about both loving both of those cultures and feeling their sting at the same time. And I start the essay with some reflections on my father, and I think one of the lines in it is that my father loved Mexico like family, warts and all. And my father was from a generation that grew up in the Jim Crow U.S. In the 1950s, saw Mexico as a refuge, as many African Americans did, because they could own property there and didn't have the restrictive covenants. If you were an intellectual or an artist, you had a place in galleries and museums and prominent places that weren't available to people in the United States. So there was a growing kind of expat population in Mexico City at the time. My father was one of those people that was coming back and forth between Mexico and the US. Met my mother, fell in love, married her, brought her to Los Angeles, and that whole experiment of the experience of race from those two different perspectives, I think, is what has shaped my own experience of race as an African-American Mexican woman. I used to joke a lot and say I didn't realize I was a woman until I got into grad school. Because being Black and Mexican was a full-time job. It's like, damn, I'm a woman too, it's been an identity that if you question the categories that one has to play in, or can opt out of, I suppose, it really does, I think, resonate with Miriam's point that so much of the pitting of these categories and groups of people against each other comes out of ignorance and comes out of a lack of recognition that somebody made these categories up for a reason that sometimes works for you and sometimes works against you. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to weave in some more thoughts as we talk.
This might be a good place to go back to Miriam. As Juan has pointed out, the book is solidly historically grounded. 1565 with St. Augustine and the arrival of the first Afro-Mexicans. I see some historians out here. I think we talk about 1619 as the sort of beginning of we're in the Museum of American History, so this book helps to correct that, not just as a kind of technical fact, but to give you some insight into what they were thinking. But the book also has poetry, but the book also, this is very much about politics, the power of definition, and where one ends up in life when in this category of Afro-Latino are torn between it. Would you talk a little about the political voices that run through here, the political dimension of some of these essays?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you're considering political. I mean, I thought the whole thing was.
There's a clarification in and of itself.
Okay. Because I think ultimately politics is about establishing where power is, where it resides, and how people struggle to attain it or to keep it. And the whole historical process in this country has been about that. It's been violence against certain people, and it's been a history of resistance to that violence that's perpetrated against certain people. But more explicitly political aspects, I guess, we could draw on, well, we can draw on some of the immigration laws, some of the reasons why certain people were allowed into this country and others were not. Why it's not until 1965 that Dominicans, for example, are really given certain access to this country, because prior to that, the laws basically kept Caribbeans out after the First World War. Or we can talk about the influence of the civil rights movement and of Black Power leaders on many of the Afro-Latinas and Latinos who were living in the Northeast in particular, because we were so much influenced by the Black neighbors that we grew up with, that we lived with. So where you had the Black Panther Party, you also had the Young Lords Party, and that was a direct influence. And it's not a coincidence that the Young Lords Party, for example, in its 10 principles, clearly stipulated that they were against racism and the oppression of women as well, but that racism was a very big deal, a big issue. 3 of the 5 Central Committee members were Afro-Puerto Ricans, and one Afro-Cuban actually, because he was Cuban-Puerto Rican. And that part of the history is also really important, that so many of the Afro-Latinos in this country really were in the Northeast because of the large numbers of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and Cubans who ended up in the Northeast part of the country. So that had a strong political impact. It certainly had it on me. I was growing up during that period, and much of who I am and what I believe in today is a direct result of the civil rights and Black Power movements of the 60s and early 70s. More political aspects of it have to do with just the basic social economic conditions of being Black and Latina or Latino in this country. So we have a couple of pieces there that demonstrate that colorism not only affects the African American community. There have been a number of studies that show that the lighter you are in skin color, the greater your opportunities. But it also affects Afro-Latinos. So there's one study, for example, that shows that despite having higher educational levels, greater cultural capital, Afro-Latinos are more likely to be unemployed than their other white Latino counterparts. So the politics for me is also demarcating that there is racism within the Latino community, not just outsiders being racist against Latinos in general, but that within the so-called Latino community there is racism, and that some people do better than others, and all of it is based, or much of it is based on color. And again, I want to make clear that this is not unique to Latinos, it also happens within the African American community. And in fact, that might be one of our points of connecting, understanding how colorism, that the pigmentocracy has affected us, how colonialism and slavery have had a profound and continue to have a profound influence on the way that we look at each other and understand or don't understand our places in the world.
You know, when I look at this volume, one of the things that comes to mind is that it is amplifying voices that have always been in this country, and it's raising the visibility. It's not giving them voice. I use that as a segue to talk about, to ask Roland Roebuck to comment here. He has been, I think easily said, the most consistent voice around. He referenced Hector Coparan, who is in the audience, who is one of the few. I've been in this institution 26 years or so. I'm just trying to think of who were the other Afro-Latinos, if any, who had any employment relationships with this institution, and that was not a full-time relationship. So what do you think this volume does to help that issue of the democratization of spaces like this? When you look around, you see a number of African Americans in our own diversity, but I'm not aware that we have any Afro-Latinos on the staff of the Smithsonian Institution.
The presence, or the lack of presence, of Afro-Latinos in this institution is indeed shameful. But at the same time, in terms of indictment, we also have to recognize that other non-Afro-Latinos have really taken up the torch to create the space for the diffusion of the Afro-Latino experience here. And the fact that this forum has been organized, you know, under the leadership of Ronald and Miriam and Eduardo speaks to that. The Latino leadership, the white Latino leadership, has not been forthright in really pushing this institution to create the spaces for the inclusion of more Afro-Latinos in all spheres of not only this organization, but national groups, okay? And I think we need to have some collective lobbying to ensure that there is an awareness of inclusion. Now, the book for me is a reference, because I see many of the initiatives, many of the characters, many of the experiences related to my involvement with some of those pieces. So it was refreshing to see how Miriam and Juan were able to collect all of this. I just want to jump briefly into my experience here in Washington, D.C. And this is a great place. It's a good lab to experience racism without spending a lot of money in travel. Because in this zip code, you have white folk, you have black folk, you have folk from all Latin American countries, and you are able to gauge very effectively, I would say scientifically, the extent of racism that you are going to suffer in dealing with all of these groups. The racism that I have suffered has intensified my militancy. Sometimes I even try to provoke it so I can counterattack, because I enjoy counterattacking. I enjoy exposing Latino races. I enjoy using the term white Hispanic, because it causes some degree of abrasiveness within those individuals that want to camouflage their racism by saying, oh, my nana in Chile was black, so therefore I deserve the discount. No, you don't deserve the discount because your nana was black. So what happens here in Washington will have repercussions throughout the nation as it relates to attempting to negotiate some solutions and to force the creation of spaces for Afro-Latinos. So, I just wanted to more or less share that.
One of the things this volume points out is the correlation or the basis of unity between the descendants of enslaved Africans in this country, in quotations, African Americans, and Afro-Latinos. Being the predominant group historically, many Black Latinos were able to find freer access by coming into the Black community. Grillo from Tampa, Ybor City is referenced as one, of course Schomburg is referenced as the other. But beyond the skin color issue, this book also has implications for the cultural questions, which don't easily correlate with skin color. And Juan, would you comment on the cultural dimensions that come through here?
Well, it cuts both ways in a sense, because you have the development of an African diasporic sense in the expansion, both from the Latino side and from the African American side, the recognition that there is blackness that's not African Americanness. And that's another area in which the push has to happen to an acknowledgement of the diversity of the U.S. Black population is something that's just kind of hitting the radar screen at this point, and in line with the idea that the overwhelming majority of enslaved Africans did not come to the United States, but went to the rest of the hemisphere. Only 5% of the total population, African descendant population, settled in the United States. So that's a real eye-opener for a lot of people, including a lot of African Americans that don't pay attention to those proportions. So I think that part of it is then a kind of acknowledgement and a coalescing of the cultures and the formation of a new culture combining the African American and the Afro-Latino and other African descendant peoples in the United States. And this is transparent in the history of the music, for example. The Afro-Latino, what's called Latin music is actually Afro-Latin music. And what's called American music is actually African American music. So it's the coming together of an Afro-diasporic musical sensitivity and so forth, and the compatibility of the musical traditions that had been separated by history as they come together is an incredible, beautiful experience, and with the outcome being Latin jazz, salsa, and so forth and so on. So the book goes into that quite a bit, so it's a coalescence. But it's also an acknowledgement of the difference, that there's an ethnic cultural difference between African Americans and Afro-Latinos that sometimes gets erased or gets blown out of proportion to the point that it separates people. And I think that the typical experiences are the Afro-Latino, particularly in earlier stretches of the historical process, finding a home among Afro-Latinos as their white compatriots shun them or discriminate against them, the racism within the Latino community. The Afro-Latinos often find a home among the African American community. And Grillo is an example, Mario Balsar is an example, who said, "I'd rather live in Harlem. Harlem is less racist than Havana," which kind of shocked a lot of people. So he chose to live in Harlem. He moved in 1930 to live in Harlem among African Americans. And Schomburg, of course, another example. As you get closer to the more present, and as the Latino population has grown and expanded, there's been another category for people, another slot. So you might be black, but because you got that Latino pigeonhole, you can say, well, I might be black, but I'm Latino.
Right.
So just as in the Latin American countries, the national identity trumps the racial identity. Oh, you might be black, but you're Peruvian, and don't forget you're Peruvian. And the blackness gets diminished. So in the Latino context as well, the Latino is used as a kind of a fallback, as an escape valve for the blacks, which is not so much the case with African immigrants or with Jamaicans or Haitians and so forth, because you've got this huge, fully acknowledged category on the census and otherwise of Latinos. So one of the problems is the count. I mean, how do you know how many Afro-Latinos there are in the United States? Since the tendency is and that's documented here very well, for the Afro-Latino to opt for a lighter complected identity, either white, and many black Latinos identify as white. And then there's these other categories that they used to fill in. So that there's a bleach, one of the articles calls a bleach in the rainbow. You know, like the rainbow, there's a gravitational pull toward whiteness within the Latino, particularly because you've got that category of Latino that people will opt for and say, well, you know, I might be black, but I'm really Latino. And so it becomes very difficult to establish how many people we're talking about. And you can't, and the data that we have so far is strictly on the basis of self-reporting, self-identification, which is only a fraction of the population that would be considered black Latino by means of their social experience. That is, they're treated like, and they occupy the same social position as other black people in the United States. So that's one of the difficulties and one of the things that brings out the cultural differentiation. Some of the really good stories in here are about people who are caught in the middle, you know, and they say, yeah, they're black, they're not trying to deny that, they realize they're going through the same crap that other black folk go through, but what about this culture? What about my Puerto Ricanness? What about I'm Latino, what about my Latino culture? And so that negotiation, that drama of experience is captured in a lot of the stories in this thing, most notably in probably what is the Afro-Latino novel, Down These Mean Streets by Piri Thomas, where you actually have a young Afro-Latino and a young African-American dialoguing with each other. What does it mean? What place do you occupy? So we include the key chapters from that book as well.
Just as Juan is talking about this dynamic of acknowledgement or claiming or what have you, in my experience, and again, this goes back to my father, I grew up in a household where the African-American side worked like this. If you walked into a restaurant, you acknowledged all the black people in the room, you did the nod, you took the census, you did the nod, and then you moved on, right? And that's just how it works. And African-American, Southern extraction, whatever, we tend to claim. Right? I mean, my father taught me how to out people for sport when I was a kid. If somebody looked like they were trying to pass, you got this. You got did you see him?
Right.
You know, it was this kind of thing. So there was this constant identification or trying to identify other people that were of the diaspora, I think for my dad, almost as a means of survival. Really, coming from that particular era. And he carried that into this Mexican context. Now, Mexico, and I can say that there are big differences between West Coast and East Coast, and having an Afro-Latino experience on the West Coast compared to the East Coast, because the Latino population on the West Coast, even now, but especially when I was growing up, was primarily a Mexican population that did not acknowledge and really was ignorant of its African relation. So, I grew up in a home where my father is giving me black history lessons because he knew I wasn't going to get him in school. And he's telling me about Guerrero and Morelos, who were the black presidents of Mexico. And here I go to my Mexican relatives in the summer to tell them about the black presidents of Mexico, and they're looking at me like I'm crazy. Like, what are you talking about? And so there was this kind of game that we developed between us, and it was a kind of the we're not crazy game, because we were identifying all these African retentions within a Mexican context. So the call and respond of jarocho music, or son, which is very much African, West African, clearly. Some of the words in Spanish vocabulary, some of the beliefs and superstitions, some of the physiology of people who may not see themselves as people of the diaspora and are living just as Mexican. And it was this outing all the time as we're going through Mexican culture. Did you recognize that that name of the town is Mandinga? Right. Well, why is it Mandinga? Right. So there was this constant recognition that wasn't shared by the Mexican family that was embracing me, but at the same time, I think rejecting this acknowledgement that I was carrying about this other piece of history that was, it wasn't the family that was rejecting it, it was the society that had just grown with that level of ignorance about its own history. So it's interesting now to see on the West Coast, and I think in the Southwest, I was talking with Eduardo earlier, about in Chicano populations right now on the West Coast particularly, there's a big interest in son jarocho, which is one of the Afro-Latino music forms from Mexico, Veracruz. So now there's beginning to be an acknowledgement of that third root within a Chicano movement that when I was in college in the 80s, in early 90s, that really wasn't the case. You know, people weren't quite there. They weren't at the point where they were culturally acknowledging this connection to diaspora in the way that I think is beginning to happen now.
Mm-hmm. On this sort of personal narrative of being, in your case, in the center of Black Mexican family, but your case being in the center of Harlem, working at the Schomburg, and mm-hmm. many African Americans, I thought he was German before I started to read history. Oh, yeah. Then I found out he was Puerto Rican, but I still have this optic often in my mind that this is Harlem, this is Black people. How did you feel working in the Schomburg? Did you feel these strains, these pulls of identity with your colleagues?
That really depended. For the most part, people thought I was African American, or maybe from one of the islands. But certainly they didn't think that I was Puerto Rican or Cuban or any of those things until I told my last name. Jiménez Román kind of gives it away. But my relations in general were all focused on African American history and African diasporic history, and I held my own, so I passed. The real difficulties, I think, have to do with the way we understand notions of what Harlem was. I can tell you, for example, that in 1925-30, a good 27% of the population of Harlem was foreign-born. We know that most people who lived in Harlem at the time were Black, but they were not all African Americans. There's an assumption that they were. We have the same statistics today for Harlem. It's approximately 25% of the population of Harlem is foreign-born. And so one of the things I like to emphasize is that the Black community, the Black folk in the United States, and certainly in Harlem, have always been a very diverse community. We just never really thought about it that way. But there's been diversity from the day the slave ships left people off in the Americas. That's right. There were about 40 or 50, about 47, I think, different ethnic groups were brought over as enslaved Africans. And so diversity has been a hallmark of the Black experience in this country. In the hemisphere, certainly it's been that way. And yet we don't connect to that. We have a notion of Blackness as being synonymous with African American, and that there is no other kind of Blackness. So part of the reason we put the book together, like I said, it had to do with my professional personal interest. A lot of it had to do with that, of complicating our notions of both Blackness and Latinidad. And how do you bridge these communities and create an understanding that we are invested in one another and have been for 500 years, that it's not about American U.S. history, but it's really a hemispheric history that we're looking at, a history where all of us have been implicated in each other's lives. And will continue to be so. We have to figure out other ways of looking at our past and forging futures.
I want to take two more comments from here before we come to you. I know Roland's always got something he wants to say, but I want to ask him something in addition to what he wants to say. And this again is on the cultural question of African cultural expressions within different communities. One of the changes that you and I have witnessed, Hector and others, in the last 30 years in this town is a significant Salvadorian population. But in one of, or perhaps the most historically important in the last 50 years, houses where Santeria has been practiced, it is significantly now Cuban Salvadorian. So the color issue is not what we knew it 30 years ago when we would go to that house. And the only white people there would be the 3 Catholic priests who would come in at midnight. Now you go and you see the Salvadorian community and you see the Cuban community. This is a cultural question. Would you comment on that in relationship to Afro-Latinos?
I think that the Salvadorian community has been at a serious disadvantage because historically the presence of Afro-Salvadorians in their country has been extremely limited.
No.
And as a result of that, they find themselves in a very difficult situation. And the situation is the following, that many of them have migrated into a predominantly black city without understanding the protocols of racism. If you're going to be racist, you have to engage in that racism, not publicly, you have to do it in the privacy of your home. Especially if you're going to be talking about black people in the presence of Roland Roebuck. Now, you may, it's two things that's going to throw you off. The name Roland Roebuck, and number two, my great looks. Because people get very confused and say, oh, he is Negro Americano, therefore I can engage in this public attack against black people, and no one is going to be aware of that. Wrong. So I have had the opportunity of using what I call teaching moments to correct many members of that community that have engaged in public attacks with respect to us. In reference to the Cuban influence and their participation in our community, I think that their presence that manifests itself in the 80s with the María, etc., created a serious connection with Africa, a connection with Santeria, a connection with drumming, a connection about understanding some of the mysteries of Africa. And that display many times takes place right here in Malcolm X Park, when we're doing some drummings, and the Cubans, their presence really helped many of us to improve on our drumming skills, because we were really listening to some drumming traditions that were very specific to Santeria, and we must be thankful for their willingness to teach us those, I will call them those drum beats. So as a result of that, we have become more connected with Africa. But at the same time, I want to end by saying that many in the Salvadorian leadership have understood how this racial attitude that emanates from their country needs to be curbed. We need to educate. The school system needs to be a forum in which we can negotiate these differences so we can create more of a cohesive community. And they always ask the same question. Oh, qué bien hablas español. And, you know, I usually tell them that my father was rich and he sent me to some Latin American country to learn Spanish, and the people are so gullible, or I'm so effective in communicating that notion that they believe it. So,
yeah, the additional cultural bridge I wanted to point to is Afro-Latino culturally, particularly coming from the Cuban influence here, has spread beyond the skin color issue into non-Afro-Latinos, but Latino estadounidenses, the new Salvadorian community, many of whom are practicing Santeria in this town. And they understand that this is an African origin and context. Juan Flores, and then we're going to come to you.
Yeah, then you can tell people.
Yeah, let's just on the left side first. I'd like the first three people to go to the mic. If your questions, commentary, critiques, you get 2 minutes. But
yeah, I wanted to follow up, especially on the application of the Afro-Latino in the U.S. presents specific conditions. One is the huge African-American population, which is not Latino. That's different from obviously from any country in Latin America. So a lot of the people who consider themselves Afro-Latino in the U.S. or would be considered Afro-Latino in the U.S. are actually the offspring, like María Rosario Jackson, of an African-American and a non-Afro, at least not by self-proclamation, non-Afro-Latina or Latino. So the children, and some of the members of the forum are like that. They're people who one parent is an African American, one parent is Latino, and they say, well, therefore I'm an Afro-Latino. So that's a particularity of the U.S. context that is very important. As time goes on, that will be more and more the case. But also another particularity is that by far the largest Latino group in the United States, as you know, is of Mexican origin and Mexican background, and sometimes called Mexican American or Chicano. And so that's the biggest challenge that we've had as we go around with the book and as we talk about these things around the country, is that the kind of reluctance for the Mexican origin population to identify with the African. There's a much stronger connection, of course, to the indigenous root of the culture and so forth. And now, as Maria was saying, that there's an awakening to the fact that there is an Afro-Mexican background in this on Jarocho, and even through hip-hop, there's some been connection, even via hip-hop through Santeria and things like that, So there's been this kind of cultural awakening, but generally it's that, the Afros are over there in Mexico, and there's been a reluctance to then embrace it as Afro-Chicano, as Afro-Mexican American experience, because, if there are any, they're over there and they're from a long time ago. And so, but what's happening now, and we're finding we go around, is that people, when they hear about this and we talk about this, they begin to become outed themselves. They say, wait, oh yeah, my grandmother, and they begin to realize that those roots do go deep, and that they're there, even though there's a tendency not to see them, even sometimes not even deliberate evasion. It's just like it never occurred to them that Carlos Santana might be an Afro-Mexican or an Afro-Chicano. It never occurred to them. Because he played blues music, African-American music, that's what makes him Afro. No, he himself will say it, that he's of African descent. So, and he's only one among many, many, many examples of this. So this is something that we're noticing that there's going to be, there is in sway right now, a kind of an outing of the Afro-Chicano population, which I think is going to be very, very important, because no longer will it be the Afro is over there in Veracruz and the Costa Chica in some other place, which is a very common phenomenon to geographically locate the Afro, even within an individual country. Oh, they all live in that town, or they live along the coast, and so forth. So the geographical location of the Afro is something that's beginning to get broken down. And the final point is that in the book, we document that right now, as we speak, there's entering into a second generation in North Carolina, large numbers of Afro-Mexican immigrants from the Costa Chica that are settled there. And we found a terrific newspaper article from the Winston-Salem that we put in the book, documenting the presence of Afro-Mexicans on the East Coast. So it begins to shatter the idea that only along the East Coast and among Caribbean Latinos do we have the Afro presence.
Okay. I should point out that notwithstanding the fact that he's Puerto Rican, Juan Flores is one of the very first Chicano Studies professors. He was actually in California at the time of the formation of this. So it is not just from opinion that he speaks, but from study. Okay, it's your chance, and here are the ground rules, because we're on the stage and you're out there. Right. You get no more than 2 minutes. You can raise a question, you can make a comment, you can make a criticism, so that you don't, there's a lot of knowledge out here in the audience, a lot of experience out here in the audience, but you get 2 minutes. Yes, sir. And we'll take 3, and then the panel will respond, and then I'll go to 3 more.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Gilberto Amaya. I am a Garifuna from Honduras. And being a Honduran makes me an Afro-Latino. But if I don't open my mouth, I can pass as an African American. So, that makes it a little complicated. But my point is that, all this fragmentation of being Afro-Honduran, Afro-Peruvian, Garifuna, African American here in this context, I believe is hurting us. And maybe we should look at something that brings us together, like being Afro-descendants or something like that. So we can start gaining more power, in this country. The other point that I wanted to follow up is on Mr. Early's comment and Roland regarding the Smithsonian Institution. I just picked up this brochure out there, talking about the Latino Center, and I don't see any black face here. So I believe the institution has to do better in that area. And I look forward to reading the book. All the comments that you have given have been very, very informative. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 minutes, yes?
Thank you, James. I'm Miriam Douglas-Ungaro, and I am Black American from the US. One of the first things I wanted to suggest is that we have a serious problem with this term African American only applying to Black people from the United States. And I think that we really have to deal with that. It's not so much about changing the demographic reality of who Black Americans are. But I don't know who decided this in the late 80s or something. We act and we do not think and discuss. And because if you're of African descent from the Americas, that's African American. You can also be then Afro-Puerto Riqueño or Cubano, etc. But for Black Americans not to think about what it means for us to say we're African American and nobody else is a serious problem. I have a group on Facebook called Afro Americas that I founded several years ago. I invite all Afro descendants of the Americas to join. It's multilingual. And the last couple of things, one is I asked several years ago, you know, the OAS had a special rapporteur on Afro descendants, and he's like disappeared. I asked about why we need to have a journalist conference for Afro-descendant journalists from throughout the Americas. Maybe the Smithsonian could help with that. And last but not least, quisiera decir en español que este es mi tercer idioma, and I'm very happy as a native English-speaking Black person that I have learned Spanish and French and so forth.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Manuel Mendez. I've been living in the United States for 18 years, especially here in Washington, D.C. I went to Bell Multicultural High School. I don't know if many people know what Bell is, but I had a great education at Bell where my teachers taught me about myself, especially porque yo soy Afro-Dominicano. There's not a lot of Dominicans that can say that with pride, because majority of them think if you say you're Black, that you are Haitian, or that kind of connotation. And I just want to thank DC for instilling that in me. But I was going to ask, not a question, but a comment. I really love this book. The moment I saw this book, I got it, and I just want to thank you. I love author Schomburg. I learned it from Dr. Clark, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. In not long from now, you all are going to get a chance to get a copy of this book, because I know you brought your checkbooks and your credit cards. Because there will be a author's signing, and 3 of the authors will be here, and Rolando will stand guard.
You got to get his signature.
If I get $5 on each book, I'm
Okay, I'm going to take one more and then ask the other 3 of you just to hold and have our panelists respond to some of the things that they've heard, and then I'll come back and get the 3 of you. And this young lady here, yes.
Hi, my name is Ariana Curtis, and I'm an anthropology student at American University. My question is, in taking this conversation between Black and Brown being pinned against each other and going from individual to family, community, nation, what kind of opportunities or challenges does 2011 present, coming out with this book in the UN declaring it El Año de Afrodescendiente? You know, what can that do to help bridge these communities, or what kind of conversations are happening around that?
Okay. Panelists?
Okay, you want to go first?
Adelante.
Okay, let me see. Gilberto presents a that's the guy from Honduras, the Garifuna, my brother. As a matter of fact, he's one of the tallest Garifunas, and he doesn't play basketball. Okay? In reference to the definition, I consider myself, it depends on the setting, but I usually say I'm Afro-Latino, I'm Afro-Puerto Rican, I am Afro-descendant, etc. and I use dignified terms, because the alternative, if you are in Central, the Caribbean, or South America, is Moreno, Prieto, blah, blah, blah.
Oscuro,
And, yeah, okay, Mayate in California. So the term has gone through what I call a semantical evolution. That is, that with consciousness, you begin to adopt certain terminology that enhances your new sense of self. Now, there are some folk that want to transcend race and want to call themselves galactic human, Afro-human, eco-human, and I am saying if you want to adopt that terminology, fine. But when you are walking in certain zip codes of this great democracy, the people are not going to say that you are eco-human. They're going to call you in very despicable names. So, not only should you embrace a term that makes you feel good, there is also a responsibility in knowing the history of this particular term that you are adapting. Coupled with that, if you're going to say that you are Afro-American, there is also a serious responsibility of understanding what is happening in the African continent. So it's not about dress, it's not about the braids, it's not about the bracelets or playing drums in Malcolm X Park on Sundays. It's about acquiring knowledge. So I cannot impose what sort of term you are going to use. For me, it's very flexible.
Okay.
Comments on any of the questions or comments raised here?
Well, I won't comment on all four because I
No,
could
but
go back.
any
But
of
I'll
them.
pick one. This notion of opportunities for bridging. Earlier, Juan mentioned people who were members of the forum, but we haven't really told you what the forum is. About 4 or 5 years ago, Juan and I started an organization called the Afro Latino Forum, or Afro-Latina Forum. It's not an @ by the way, on the book cover. It's a way of including, being gender inclusive, and so because Spanish is such a gendered language, we use the @ because it's an A and an O, so that's how you should read it. Anyway, we started the Afro-Latino Forum about 5 years ago, in part because of what I said earlier, about this notion of somehow black and brown being in conflict, and the fact that Black Latinos and Latinas were not being included in that discourse because we were part of the brown, but we were also part of the black. So we figured that the Afro-Latino Forum could speak specifically to the ideas of Black Latinas and Latinos as a bridge, as a way of connecting these two communities that supposedly were on the attack. First of all, questioning the ground rules. Are they really in conflict? Or is this a representation that's being imposed on these communities? And secondly, that we as Black Latinos live those two experiences. We live a social reality of blackness. Before anybody asks me what I eat for dinner, or what my mother's language was, my mother tongue rather was, I am treated in a particular way. And when I say this, people are often confused. They say, well, you don't look that dark. But this, yeah. But there is not, I can't think of the last time that it did, that I go through the airport in San Juan, that I am not stopped under the assumption that I'm too black to be Puerto Rican. I must be Dominican. Or go into a bodega and ask for something in Spanish, and the bodega owner will respond to me in English. Somehow, like, it's unacceptable. I cannot be speaking Spanish to him. That must happen to you too. Huh?
Yes, it happens.
And right.
So even our notions of where blackness begins and ends should be put into question. And that's part of the work of the forum, to really kind of dissect these categories and how we understand our realities and our identities, because identities and realities don't always come together in sync. So opportunities for bridging. The forum is one of those opportunities. We try to have dialogues. We're having a conference. In fact, we're going to put some of the the information out there. We're organizing a conference for November in New York City, and we're using 3 venues: the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, El Museo del Barrio, and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Basically trying to bring people who don't normally speak to each other because they don't go to each other's spaces, bringing them together by force because they're going to be involved in this kind of conversation, these dialogues that are both within communities, inside of the African American, inside the Latino, and across communities, because Black Latinos and Latinas are going to be there. And the only way we can be whole is if both those groups are also there.
Quickly, and then we'll get to these.
Not a lot to add, just on the issue of the national being kind of stuck with the national, because why don't we just all, we try to do with the Afro-Latino is to promote the idea of cross-ethnic, cross-national fusion, relation, so forth and so on, but retaining an acknowledgement and respect for the national particularities of the struggle in Ecuador is different from the struggle in Colombia, is different from that in Dominican Republic, is different from Puerto Rico, and that in Latin America is different from that in the United States, so that you can't erase that even though you're striving for maximum unity hemispherically and globally. You've got to bring those things into play. I think I mentioned before about the particularity of the U.S. with of these 2 huge groups that are being pitted against each other. The Afro-Latino, the need for an Afro-Latino perspective arises from that attempt to put a wedge between. That's a specificity of the United States that we have to keep in mind, which gets to the issue of the African American, that the African American is, it's definitely wrong, the nomenclature is definitely wrong, but the need to specify for the African diaspora experience in the U.S. is clear. You can't just transfer Brazil to the United States and make believe it's the same thing.
Right.
So I think that's a guiding concept that we use. Maria.
Just to build on that, I think I want to underscore that it's important to be able to have a pan-identity that people can come under together, but that pan-identity doesn't diminish the importance of distinction. And that from a policy perspective, because that's what I do for work, you have to recognize when the differences matter.
Right.
And sometimes they don't matter, but sometimes they do.
Yeah.
And to have the level of knowledge and information to know the difference, I think is what is the huge challenge.
Before we take these last 6 quickly, and then we're going to go to the book signing. Just 2 quick points. One on the African American question. Some of you are aware that since the 1965 Immigration Act, more Africans from the continent of Africa have come to the United States than were brought during the entire period of slavery. Only 500,000 enslaved Africans, more or less, were brought here. One of them in Pretoria, South Africa last week on the African continent said, "You people are not the diaspora, you from Brazil, you from the US, you from Panama, so forth and so on. We are the new diaspora." So these are complex and complicated issues. I was told the same thing in New York when I convened and moderated for the African Union in this 6th region going on. The other point is on Afro-Descendientes. In 1999, when all Black people, a representative of all Black people from this hemisphere, went to Chile for the preparatory conference for the World Conference Against Racism in 2000 in Durban, Romero Rodriguez, who is the Director General of Mundo Afro in Uruguay, has written and documented this. We went, he was speaking of Latin Americans, we went in as negros, we left as Afro-Descendientes. But so did we. Marta Vega, who is in this volume from the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York, many of you will know Marta's work, a few years afterwards called me and says, "James, when you use the term, not me personally, but us in general, when you say Black Americans, you're not including Afro-Latinos." And so she started a little forum called "Who is an African American in the US in the 21st century and what are the policy implications?" So these are complexities that we need to look at. Let's take this young lady here, and then we'll alternate, get you all in, and we'll have one closing round of comments from my panelists.
Hi, my name is Francisca Orellana, and I'm from Chile. And I wanted to thank you all for this great conversation. It's been really great. But I want to hear more about the mujeres and your guys', your ladies' experience on growing up with what I think is this very I guess mixture of culture and also I don't know, gender schemas or whatever. How was it to grow up as a mujer in being like a Latina and an Afro-Latina, like, because everyone puts a different like name or categorization for you, and they have different expectations at that moment. So how was it to grow up as a mujer, as an Afro-Latina mujer, and also how is it right now? Like, has it been different? And I want to hear about that.
Good. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. My name is Nyla Goburn, and I exercise my flexibility. I call myself a Black Latin American woman. And a comment and a question. Mr. Roebuck, thank you for mentioning I found myself in multiple occasions around Latin Americans. I tell them where I'm from Panama, and all of a sudden they forget how my hair looks and my skin, and they start talking bad about Black Americans. And it's insulting. They don't think they're insulting me just because, oh no, you're not American, so I can talk bad. So I thank you for bringing that point up. And my question is, does the book address the inappropriateness of the word Hispanic that the U.S. has imposed on us?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, my question is very related to that, just that. Can you please put me up to speed between the difference of the use of the terms Hispanic and Latino? Is it a political choice? What do they mean now? Because to me, they both imply and mean European descent. Both words to me mean European descent. So why do people choose one over the other? What is the modern definition of both terms?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Giselle Gilpin, and both of my parents were born and raised in Panama. I was born in Mexico. So I have a very interesting background, and as well as how I look. I don't look like I'm from those places. So when I try to explain to people, American and Latino people, they always say, well, how come your last name's not Sanchez or Lopez or something like that? And so I would like to get to, well, and I always thought it had to do with slavery. I just kind of was like, well, maybe, because I knew that a lot of times the slaves took the names of the slave masters. So I don't know how I got this name, how my family got these, and a lot of Black Panamanians that I know have last names like Johnson, Brown, whatever, and I always wonder how that came to be, and I always feel like I'm looked at not Latino enough. I'm not Latino because I don't have that name attached to the look or how so I just wanted to know your perspective on that.
Okay, I'm going to finish on this side, and then we'll see if we can get you in. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Winfred Parnell. I live in Texas, and this has been quite educational for me personally. What I'm wondering is, does the Smithsonian have any inclination or any thoughts about doing something like this in places like Texas and Arizona and places of that sort, where some education would be a great opportunity to help, so we don't pit those two groups against each other, help them understand the commonalities that they have between them, because that's a big issue in places like Texas and Arizona. So I'll wait to hear your comments.
Very good. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Ada Alvarez, and I have two questions. In terms of identity, I understand what you say about trying to locate African-American communities to a place. I'm Puerto Rican, and my father was Cuban, and in Puerto Rico, I saw there's racism or problems with identifying with being Black. Like the last census says 96% were white because people had issues identifying as a Black person. So in Puerto Rico, I was very involved on bomba dancing, or Afro roots, embracing the mix of Spanish, Indian, and African in my heritage. Some people were weirded out about my proudness of being a bomba dancer. So what do you say would be a way to embrace our African roots when you have a different color, like me, without necessarily being Black, but wanting to express our Black heritage? And second, as a journalist, I've seen a tendency on Spanish-speaking media to glorify beauty when it's light skin or has white features. How do you deal with the media when language gives us access to information or sometimes of some term of identity, especially in the US, when the message is looking Black is not good or it would not give you far?
Good. Last comment.
Hi, my name is Jiménez. I'm Dominican, raised in Miami, Florida. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about the original differences when it comes to identifying with being Afro-Latino. For example, growing up in Miami, Florida, it was ingrained in my head without even knowing. I grew up in Hialeah, which is a very Cuban-American community, that I'm Dominican, I'm immigrant, I'm Latino, that's it. That's all I knew. speak Spanish at home every day. You're Dominican, you're Latino, you're an immigrant. Then I came to school here in Washington, D.C., did my undergraduate degree at GW, and it opened up a whole new world for me. And I learned, oh, okay, there's a different way of looking at being Latino, which I wasn't exposed to being in Miami. And then my second question is having to do with generational differences. How do you see younger people in their 20s? Because I've noticed my generation in my 20s, even younger people among Latinos, I honestly, from experience, I feel very welcomed. I just feel like I'm Latino. I haven't had that much experience feeling like we're categorizing each other depending on nationality or skin color, but that's been my experience generationally. Maybe it's changing, maybe it's just my experience. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Pick one.
I think the generational issue is particularly interesting and important. And I forget who I was talking with about this recently, but there is something about people now in their 20s who have grown up with the internet and have grown up where the world is smaller in a way and more fluid in some respects. And that's not to say that racism has gone away and that historic barriers have disappeared, but there is a different kind of fluidity that I think allows us to maybe question the nomenclature more effectively. That would give us an opening to think about the possibility of new language or the possibility of different categories, or even thinking about when categories matter and when they don't. So I see that as a promising moment where the kind of work that I think Miriam and Juan have done with this book feeds that. It gives one fodder to think about how might we look at this reality differently, how might we frame it differently, and I'm excited that there's a new generation that is open to that.
Right, we found like the new generation, the forum, for example, most of the members are in their 20s, and they're more, and I teach in college, teach course Afro-Latino history and culture for about 8 years already now, and I find that at that age, people are more open to the idea of thinking social experience and identity in new ways, rather than just settle for the categories and that Maria was talking about earlier in her own experience, how these boxes, you get put into different boxes, and her article is a lot about that. You know, you just get slotted into different things. Well, the young people are saying, well, you know, let's think about it differently. And again, hip hop generation is a lot to do with it. I mean, the Afro-Latino, hip-hop is an Afro-Latino invention in a lot of ways. It came out of the collaboration and the melding together of the young African-American and Puerto Rican and other Caribbean people. That's what it is. That's what hip-hop is. You know, and it's testament to that coming together. So I think that the generational thing is very important in the work, and that's when the young Dominicans are beginning now in this generation to affirm their Africanness, you know, and say it, put it right out front. And as the young, you don't even have to come to DC for that to happen. It's even happening in the Dominican Republic. So there is change afoot, and a lot of it has to do with that transnational hemispheric relation, that some of the stuff that people come to realize here gets back there. Some of the things from there and the movements come here, and we're beginning to learn ways in both directions. One last little point on the Panamanian surnames. Many Panamanians have English surnames because of the importation of West Indian documents, pardon me, or French, right, French background, because the importing of Caribbean workers for the Canal Zone. And so that you have a whole West Indian population that is Panamanian, that has become Panamanianized, and many of those people migrated to the United States, partly because they didn't feel totally at home in Panama. They were never fully accepted as Panamanians, partly because of their last names and because of the language they spoke. So that's just a historical clarification so that you understand that, but don't let anybody ever tell you because of what your last name is, thinking of Roland Roebuck, what your last name is, or Schomburg, that you're not Afro-Latino, or that you're not Latino, or that you're not Afro, for that matter.
Our Teofilo Stevens.
Teofilo
You know,
Stevens.
the great Cuban boxer.
Well, it speaks to what you were saying earlier about the multiple diasporas, multiple migrations. We've been moving for thousands of years. Forget about the Americas. Throughout the world, for thousands of years, people have been going from one place to the other. And you've either been accepted, you've completely assimilated, forgotten the other, or not been accepted. For example, Dominican Republic, who still does not recognize third and fourth generation folk who have always lived in Dominican Republic, but whose ancestors were Haitian, they still are not acknowledged. They're not given citizenship. The Panamanian case is another one where it took decades before people from the Caribbean whose parents were from the Caribbean, they were already second and third generation, before they were acknowledged. And in fact, this is something I will say about the book, that one of our failures was not really a failure, but it was imposed on us. We looked very hard for material on Panamanians in the United States, and we couldn't find any. And as it turned out, most of the Panamanian scholars, and there are a number of really excellent scholars here, are writing about the experience in Panama. So we're always connected somehow to our home countries, or our grandparents' home countries even, because the issues that are important in those countries influence what we consider important here. And this is one of the reasons why we decided that we wanted to focus the book on the United States, that it wasn't a negation of what's going on in the rest of the hemisphere, but almost an illustration of how connected we really are. But that's not what I wanted to speak to. I wanted to speak specifically to the question of gender, exactly. We do have a section that is on Afro-Latinas. Growing up Black and Latina is not an easy thing to do. And so we decided we needed to focus that particular topic. And again, there are absences. One of the other points of the book actually is to show where the gaps are and to kind of get people into the mood of doing further research. This young man who said he loved the book, it means everything to me that you said that, because this was a book that I wish had existed when I was 17, 18 years old and trying to figure out my place in the world. But the chapter on gender, on being Afro-Latina, it's gender and sexuality, we have one piece that traces the phenomenon of being Afro-Latina and a lesbian. And basically says, there isn't anything out there and why am I invisible? So that's another level of invisibility. The book in general talks about degrees of invisibility, of not being who people expect, or not representing what people expect at any given moment, and what that means for you, or how that can destroy your notions of your very essence of what you are. And that section on Afro-Latinas goes back to an early essay that was written in the 70s by Angela Jorge, Puerto Rican. And that's another, maybe I feel like I should apologize, but there's a lot of Puerto Ricans. There's a lot of Puerto Ricans, but we were the first Latino group who came in significant numbers and had this intimate relationship with African Americans. And so it's a very logical thing for it to dominate, our group to dominate the volume. But Angela Jorge was the first one who addressed specifically being Black Latina in the United States and what that meant. And we end with a more recent piece where she labels herself a Latinegra that basically covers the same ground and just goes into it a little bit deeper. And so if you look at that section, it's an argument for doing more research. It says we haven't gotten that far from the essay in the 1970s to what we're reading today in 2010. So that brings me to the other issue of Latinegra. She calls herself a Latinegra. I call myself an Afro-Latina. In the 1900s, in the early part of 1900, the 20th century, there was a series of debates that took place among African Americans, both activists and scholars. And there was one piece, and I'll never forget the title, that said, "Are we Afro-American, African-American, Negro, or colored?" I don't think that's a debate that we're going to resolve today.
Right.
I don't even think it's going to be resolved in the 21st century. Right. But I won't be here to do that. The point is that what Rolando was saying is really important. You call yourself whatever you feel comfortable with. And that can change. At one point, when I was growing up in Harlem, I was Spanish. Because all people who spoke Spanish, no matter what they look like, were Spanish. Today, some people still call me Spanish. I have a neighbor who was shocked after 10 years of knowing me, heard me speak Spanish and said, Girl, I thought you were black. You're Spanish.
You're Spanish, right?
So.
Rolando.
Okay. On the issue of Latino media, yes, they tend to be very Eurocentric with the portrayals. It's an addiction. There is a group called the National Hispanic Media Coalition under the leadership of Dr. Angel Nogales. That group, a couple months ago, attacked CBS, NBC, and the major networks, accusing them of excluding Latinos from these networks. So I sent him a note and I said to him, I am going to snitch. I am going to tell those networks not to include Latinos because Telemundo, Univision, and all these other Spanish networks exclude Afro-Latinos. So when I said that to him, he was sort of upset. We were supposed to do a radio program, and he backed away from participating with me in that debate. The point number two, with respect to Puerto Ricans, etc., when I use the term Afro-Puerto Rican in the island, the first thing they say is, oh man, we don't see you as Afro, we see you as Puerto Rican. So you are developing some serious issues because you have been associated with Afro-Americans for too long. So it is a process of education. And my position is that white Hispanics or white Puerto Ricans, sometimes they resent that term, but they also have a right to participate in their culture. So it shouldn't, Bombay Plena should not just be about people that look like me. Okay? Now, with respect to the name, I was very shocked. As a matter of fact, I was very depressed. When I was in Denmark, I was doing some research, and I discovered, I was reading this paper, it was called the Avis. In 1898, there was an announcement saying, we are looking for this particular slave. He has run away, blah, blah, blah. They were paying, I think, $4 for his capture. The name of the slave owner was Jarvis Roebuck. Okay, so it was very hurtful to see that. But we need to understand that under the institution of slavery, this name passing was very, very common. So I'm still traumatized. Good. And last thing, one area that we really haven't touched upon is the whole issue of how in Central and South America, within the Latino experience, interracial marriages are viewed. And I have a nice time when I go to especially to Mexico with my wife, who's right there, Sylvia Moreno, behind the lady with the black hat. Okay?
In front of the garifuna.
And the folk look at us sort of strange.
That's his wife?
And I enjoy the moment, but that's another issue.
That's another issue.
Well, let me just pick up two quick points, and then we're going to move to the book signing. Dr. Roy Bice Laporte, who is of an older generation, a Panamanian scholar, was here at the Smithsonian on soft money for a short while. This is a question from our Garifuna brother who has raised the issue, a democratic issue in this institution. It is not an issue about the Latino Center. The Latino Center also had to struggle, and I literally mean struggle. It had to fight to get into this historically Eurocentric organization. I know that because I was tied to that in part. The Asian Pacific American Center has had to fight to democratize this institution. It is a constant struggle, but that's what identity is also about, as we have heard. The terms change, the conditions of struggle change, and we name them as we go along. So look at it in a positive point of view. In that regard, I'd like to acknowledge Eduardo Lopez, who is the director of the Latino Center. Diaz. I've got Rene Lopez on my mind. Ronald Waterman and...
Stand up, Ronald, so people could...
Yes, stand up.
Ronald is ever present in our community. He doesn't just sit here like some of us tired to our desk. You will see him all about. And Magdalena Mieri here at the Museum of American History. I opened by saying that the mandate of this institution is the increase and diffusion of knowledge. This is a public trust, and I think you have exemplified that today in that you have not just come as an audience, but you have been actively engaged with the stewards who work here, people like Dr. Faith Ruffins, who's doing a very important project on immigration that will address some of these questions. So you have an active role in what we do of raising the questions, making the criticisms, and also making the recommendations. But you have an additional role because it's your institution, we are the public stewards of it. That is, you have a role in talking to the powers to be wherever they are about what this institution needs to reflect the diversity, not only of us racially and ethnically, but fundamentally us culturally. This has been an impressive audience on a Saturday afternoon. I urge you now to make that final step and go out front, get this book, and meet these authors. And we do hope that in the coming months we will do another round here, perhaps at Busboys and Poets. I'm looking for a sponsor. I heard the gentleman who said, let's bring it to Texas. I think Eduardo heard you and Ronald heard you. And who knows, we are a national institution and we have associate programs. So you just may see us not in the too distant future there. Please go forth and meet these authors. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.